The other side of the argument wants to state that we can't take the standard situation as governing all landlord-tenant interactions. And the reason for that is that they argue that the bargaining power and economic situation of the landlords and the tenants is not equal. And that means we have an occasionally unusual submarket within the rental market that needs special protections and special legislative treatments. So to see that, let's put the two parties involved and see how the pro-rent control case will analyze it. We'll say if we take the standard tenant, tenants economically speaking are on average poorer. They are not typically prosperous individuals. Some people rent even though they could afford to own, but most people are tenants because they can't afford to own a house. They haven't saved up the down payment, their credit is not strong enough to warrant taking out a mortgage, and so forth. So they are on average economically poorer. By contrast, if we look at landlords, landlords are correspondingly richer, right, on average. Now, not all landlords are rich, but almost by definition, if you are in a position to be a landlord, that is to say that you've got extra real estate available or you have more living space than you yourself need, your basic living needs are dealt with, looked after, and so you have extra space that you can make money from by renting it out to other people. So we have a contrast between a party that is economically poorer and an economically richer party. Now also, the advocates of rent control will point out that in some rental markets, the available bargaining power to tenants is much less than the available bargaining power to landlords. I need to slip an A in there. And the reason for that is that rent control arises as an issue in rental markets that are characterized by relative scarcity. Most rural areas and small cities and towns do not think about rent control as a policy. Not even all major cities will think of rent control as a policy, but some large cities are characterized by very high population. It's an attractive location. Many people want to live there for various reasons, but at the same time, the available supply is low. So we can think of, in the American context, cities like New York or San Francisco as paradigmatic examples. Both of them are largely surrounded by water, and that means that there are severe limitations to how much the city can expand outward. Of course, we can build upward, but building upward is very expensive, right, compared to building outward. And so in the case of New York City, which is perhaps a dozen or more miles long, at least the Manhattan portion of it and Harlem portion of it, and maybe a mile to 2 miles wide, we have a very limited geographical amount of space, and in that we have very expensive real estate and a high population density. So we have very high demand and relatively low supply, and what that means is that the price goes up. So in those situations, you've got lots and lots of tenants, right, who are competing for relatively scarce available rental housing. That means the price pressure is going to be up. Landlords are going to know that there are any number of tenants who will accept the apartment, and so they can raise their prices. Tenants know that there are any number of other tenants competing for a very low number of rental units, and so they are going to be forced, from their perspective, to pay more than they otherwise would deem appropriate. So the argument here is that we have bargaining that was going on between unequals. Unequals in terms of their economic status and unequals in terms of their economic bargaining power. So this position then says, if we have a free market, that is to say, the initial circumstances, if we just leave it to people to negotiate voluntary win-win transactions, what's going to happen in a free market is landlords are going to be able to charge very high prices, so they will win, so to speak. They'll make lots of profits. They won't have any trouble attracting and retaining tenants. And then by contrast, tenants, from this perspective, are going to be, particularly the poorer tenants, forced to pay very high prices for their rents, and they're going to then have to make sacrifices in other areas of their lives, and so they are going to lose, right, from this analysis. So what we have then is a result that has landlords gaining at the expense of tenants, and we can add a moral label This side then will argue that we have predatory pricing that is going on. Landlords are in a position to gouge their tenants. Landlords are in a position to take advantage of their tenants. And so what we have in a free market is a negative, morally negative set of transactions that go on. All right, so how do we solve this problem then? Well, this says if this is the way bargaining power works out in a free market, then we need to have some more powerful force to intervene in the free market to achieve a morally acceptable result. And so that power is going to be the government. And so we characterize the role of government from this side as differently from this side. This side says protect people's liberty rights and protect people's property rights. This position wants to argue if we do that, we end up in predatory situations. So instead, the government should take a more paternalist role. And what paternalists do is they use their greater power to protect the weaker or the underprivileged or those who are being taken advantage of. So in this case here, what we want to do is we need to protect the weaker party from being taken advantage of by the stronger party. And so that then means taking that abstract formulation and applying it to the rental market, protecting the weaker tenants, right? Their weaker bargaining power, weaker economic status, from the stronger landlords, economically stronger in terms of bargaining power as well. And so there are any numbers of ways that governments could try to do this, including just writing welfare checks to the weaker party. But one legislative tool is rent control. And what we do by enacting rent control is placing a price ceiling. The government will establish what they think tenants can appropriately handle, and then say for apartment units of a certain size and quality and so forth, the rent may not rise above this ceiling, and it's set at a cost of living standard that is hopefully appropriate for tenants. So what we have then is a piece of legislation that lowers the price of rent. As a result of that, tenants benefit, right, or they gain from the piece of legislation. And the expectation here is that the landlords, of course, will lose. They will not be able to make as much money as they otherwise would be able to make in a free market, right? Or they were charging free market prices. Now they have to lower their prices, and so they lose economically. Now we can ask, what is the difference between this cell and this cell over here? Over here we had a win-lose transaction, one party winning, one party losing. Over here, we also have a win-lose transaction, one party winning and one party losing. So why, from the perspective of advocates of rent control, is this scenario better than this scenario? And the answer that is given is that in this scenario, it is the stronger party that is sacrificing or being sacrificed for the sake of the weaker party. Or this is a policy that causes the rich to give up for the sake of the poor. Whereas over here, what we have is the rich taking advantage of the poor. So this position is preferable from the perspective that says the rich have a moral obligation to give up, to help, or at least not to take advantage of the weaker. And so what we have here is, we'll put this in brackets, is a kind of altruism, right? Or at least it's an altruistic moral philosophy that's used as a justification for a given political piece of legislation. Classical altruism argues that we have obligations to sacrifice for the sake of those who are less well off, and one popular version of altruism, and that's what we have applied in this particular case. All right, we'll pause there and then turn to the other side of the debate.